Interesting fact, Gallup does it, an annual survey, most and least trusted professions. They've been doing it for 30 years, always at the bottom of the list, very predictable. Lawyers, used car salesmen, politicians, everybody gets that. Top of the list, people don't immediately come to mind. The answer is nursing. Most powerful factor in the trust equation out of the four factors, credibility, reliability, intimacy, low self-orientation. The strongest one, according to a regression analysis of our data, is intimacy, closely followed by self-orientation. NPS, it's one number, that purports to measure everything. It's pretty cool. Last month, I was at a conference of CROs and CMOs from major professional service organizations, and they're spending millions of dollars refining their NPS metrics. And I think, no, get back to basics. Go right what Reichheld wrote originally. What are the dynamics? And you can use data here, but you don't oversimplify it to the point that people mindlessly follow a single metric. Some of the simplest ways to build trust are, the easiest one of all probably goes to reliability. Make a lot of promises and keep every one of them. They don't even have to be big promises. I'll show up at 1:45. Show up at 1:45. How hard is that? Do that 10 times in a row? Guess what? They begin to trust you quite a bit more. But maybe the biggest one is simply get better at listening. And I don't mean listening to collect data. I don't even mean so-called active listening. I mean listening so that the other party feels heard.
What do buyers really fear?
I think they fear being taken advantage of, comes to mind, being unfairly treated, like somebody else is getting a better deal than I am, which is one of the reasons I and you, I think, always suggest get price out in the open early. Because very much when you're meeting customers, one of the big questions on their mind is, how much is this going to cost? And conventional sales training says, don't mention price until you've established value, which I think is dead wrong. Get price out there. If you have 1 foot in yesterday and 1 foot in tomorrow, you're well positioned to piss on today.
I shall definitely be stealing that one. Hello, and welcome back once again to the Inquisitor Podcast with me, Marcus Cauchi. Today, my guest is one of my favorite return guests, Charlie Green. He's the author of 3 books, or co-author of at least one of those, or 2 of those, The Trusted Advisor Field Manual, and what I consider to be the best book on sales, trust-based selling. He's been a mentor of mine, massively influential. So if you hear anything about trust, odds are it's got some root in Charlie's work. And without any further ado, Charlie, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm prone to flattery, so I really appreciate you saying those kind of things. Thank you.
For those who aren't familiar with you or your work, could you give us 60 seconds on your history, please?
Sure, I'll try and keep it shorter than that. I'm American, as anybody can tell by listening already. Grew up in the Midwest, had an undergraduate degree in philosophy, got an MBA at Harvard Business School, spent 20 years in management consulting. Then started writing those books and founded a small company called Trusted Advisor Associates, which focuses on trust and trust-based relationships, mainly in B2B sales and in professional services vertical market. And there we are today.
Lovely. Okay, well, let's get right into the meat and grist of today's topic, which is trust. We both agree that trust is a very human characteristic. And I think too often there's a controversy around what trust means, what trust is. So let's start with a definition from Charlie. What does trust mean to you? Not as a concept, but as a lived human experience.
Yeah. Well, I like that you started off with, trust is a human thing. Like all things human, we're a mix of what I would call the rational and the emotional. And trust is a great exemplar of that. It's got kind of equal parts of each, and we need to take them both into account. Another useful thing to keep in mind is institutional trust versus personal trust. My own view is that institutional trust, I like the phrase thin trust. It focuses mostly on the rational, and some dynamics that come into play in personal trust, which is much thicker, are not really present in institutional trust. And the last thing I would say is a simple way to think about it. Trust, the noun, trust in a relationship is made up of interactions between 2 parties, a trustor and a trustee, one who does the trusting and one who is or is not trusted. The key salient aspect of a trustor is they take a risk. Without risk, there is no trust. And the salient aspect of a trustee is they are or are not trustworthy. And I think the Trusted Advisor book became kind of famous mainly because of what we call the trust equation, which is really the trustworthiness equation, which explores the trustee aspect. What does it mean to be trustworthy? So those are, and it plays out very personally. In my own career, I've been thinking about trust for almost 40 years at this point, and it has bled into my personal life in profound and useful ways. And I no longer automatically see a distinction between trust at work and trust in our personal lives. They bleed into each other. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Okay. Well, if we look at how trust manifests, I think there are a lot of myths that leaders have a tendency to cling on to. Now, you've been studying trust for decades. So, what are those myths and why do they still persist?
Great question. I'd have to say top of the list is trust takes time, and its close friend. Trust takes a long time to build, but only a moment to destroy. Technically, both of those are mostly false. Trust in one of its manifestations does indeed take time, and that's when we talk about trust as related to reliability. He's dependable, he's reliable. Well, that takes repeated experiences over time. And so, in that regard, yeah, trust takes time. But in all the other aspects, which are primary, trust actually gets created in moments or in brief interludes, interactions between people. Things like the firmness of a handshake, the pause in a conversation, the way you look at somebody, and we emerge, saying, "Wow, I really trust that person." Little things that you say, stuff like that. And as to the other part, a long time to build, a moment to destroy very largely not true. If you have a deep trusted relationship with somebody and they screw up, you don't toss them out the door. You cut them some slack, you give them a break because you have a history of trust. You're willing to say that was an anomaly, that was an exception, we'll give you another break. So those are the two big myths that come to mind. There's, I guess, another one worth mentioning. People tend, this is not an overt myth, but people tend to believe, if you ask them about it, that trust is mostly a cognitive, rational phenomenon. And to a great extent, to mostly, it's not. Oh, I'll leave it at that.
Suzanne and I were debating yesterday because she was watching that clip about from Brené Brown about the marble jar, and her response to it was, "Well, that's all well and good, but if someone does breach trust, then it forms a crack in the jar." And I'm curious about your reaction to that.
I know Brene Brown. I don't know that particular reference. Yeah, to the crack in the jar, but I think the research, I've always been struck by the research in customer relationships. A broken relationship repaired is often stronger than one that was unbroken to begin with. William James, in Varieties of Religious Experience, talked about the once born and the twice born. The once born religious person is born and raised as religious throughout their life. They're deeply faith, their life is calm, everything fits together. But the twice born are those who've been to hell and back and know the difference. And I've always thought that's a stronger faith if you know the opposite side of things. So my sense is if you make a huge mistake and you sufficiently hold yourself accountable for it, apologize where appropriate, take responsibility, you have just built a deeper level of trust than somebody who never questioned it.
Well, again, I think often a myth that leaders have is that they have to appear strong.
Yeah,
And in doing that, they never admit their
absolutely.
frailties and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And for those who've listened to the podcast, historically, you'll know the definition of vulnerability comes from the Latin vulnerabilis. And that means to put yourself in harm's way, make yourself woundable, and do it anyway. And that's an act of
Exactly.
courage. Um,
Absolutely.
so, my next question that builds on your previous point is what's happening emotionally between two people when that repair succeeds?
Well, when that repair succeeds, you're right to point to vulnerability. It says that one party has opened up to the other, and one of the fundamental principles Robert Cialdini pointed out years ago was reciprocity. If I offer myself vulnerably to you, your natural response is to do the same. So there's a level of intimacy that gets increased. It also demonstrates the ability to show yourself as vulnerable and to take responsibility, for example, says, I'm not in this for ego. I'm not playing you. This is real. I messed up, for example, or I don't know, for example. We talked about yesterday. Those are statements of I'm not omnipotent. I'm not going to try to pretend that I am. And you're dealing with somebody here who's strong enough to admit that we're, not omnipotent and that we are vulnerable. So it reveals a deeper level of oneself, and that I think leads to increased trust between the two parties.
So let's look at the flip side of that. If trust lives in those moments, what are the moments that injure trust the most?
Lying is a big one, which comes in a multiplicity of roles. You mentioned yesterday in a conversation, over promising and under promising and over delivering, which for many people is a mantra. You're supposed to do that. No, I've argued that's lying twice.
Yep.
On both ends of it, and that's corrosive after not very long. So, lying is one. I learned something from an old mentor years ago. Not a trained psychologist, a CEO, but pretty good amateur, and he said the root negative human emotion is fear.
Mhm.
If you scratch the surface of any other, anger, resentment, whatever, you'll find fear. And it's always productive to say, what fear? Fear of what? Where's that coming from? And to explore that question. So I think any reactions that seem defensive, for example, or that are rooted in resentment, those are corrosive elements for trust. They reveal your. We don't trust people who operate from fear because that tends to be self-oriented. They're fearful for something about themselves. We like to deal with people who are not afraid for themselves and therefore are free to focus on what's good or bad for other people. That's a huge dynamic.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, certainly all the research that I've been doing over the last 6, 7 years has led me to the conclusion that fear is the primary driver, and it's more often than not driven by uncertainty,
Yeah,
ambiguity, um, dissonance. But if someone is uncertain or unclear, the default setting of their brain is to catastrophize and go to the worst
sure.
case scenario.
Yeah,
And the net result of that is that you, in the sales process, you effectively create anticipatory buyer's remorse
yeah,
because they're imagining why this is not going to work and it backfiring on them.
yeah.
And if I look at the ghosting in the middle of the pipeline that goes on, more often than not, it can be easily traced back to a moment where someone imagined what it would be like after they bought from this person or this organization, and they
Right.
felt unsafe. And that's where the fear kicked in.
Yeah. By the way, let me just make two comments about that. One, this harkens back to how you started. Trust is the human kind of thing. And that fear reaction that you trace through buyer's remorse and so on is a perfect instance of the humanity of trust. We all have these fears. We all have that trigger instinct to default. So it's a very human thing that you're talking about here. Second, let me just take the opportunity. You mentioned your 7 years of research or so. You and Andy Paul are the two people in the whole sales area that I consider to be the most well-read, far more better read than I am. And I just wanted to say for anybody listening, Marcus Kauke is remarkably well read. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I'll take that. Um, so I'm curious, what happens if only we name and remove those trust injury moments? Would trust rise naturally?
Well, interesting question. What's your take on that? I kind of think so, but let me
I
throw that
asked the
one back to you
question
first.
first.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough.
Um,
I have a tool. One of the tools that I developed, or we developed originally in the book, The Trusted Advisor, and I've played with since, a simple tool called Name It and Claim It. If you name it, you can claim it. If you can speak the fear out loud in public to other people about what's driving the fear dissipates. It's like, the sign of waving, what is it, garlic in front of Dracula or
yeah.
something? One of those things. So there is a lot to be said for if you can articulate publicly what you're afraid of. You'll find everybody else goes, "Oh, I'm glad he said that." Yeah, I can relate to that. I resemble that remark.
Well,
Uh,
interestingly enough, I always tell people lead with your glass chin. Tell them the
yeah,
reasons why you are wrong,
exactly,
a bad fit. Tell them the reasons why you may be a compromise alternative,
exactly.
and be completely honest and transparent. And so, yeah, I mean, we're in violent agreement here.
Yes,
But I think you're also touching on the most important operator within the trust equation, which is intimacy.
right.
So let's just build on that because um, I think most salespeople and most leadership focus on the wrong end of the or the wrong parts of the equation, which are
Yes,
credibility and reliability, and
yes,
they seem to be far and away the weakest part of the whole trust build. So let's talk about why intimacy and low self-orientation are so critical and
right.
so often overlooked.
Yeah, well, let me just say, you and I have had dialogues about the role of measurements and metrics and everything. I'm always skeptical of attempts to measure stuff like trust, but we did do our own measurements and metrics and studies, and they did support a couple of key findings. That's one of them, that the most powerful factor in the trust equation out of the four factors, credibility, reliability, intimacy, low self-orientation, the strongest one, according to a regression analysis of our data, is intimacy, closely followed by self-orientation. Those are the two what I call emotional factors, the non-rational factors. And it's no accident, those two are pretty hard to measure. It's not hard to measure credibility. Look at the degrees attached to somebody's name. It's not hard to measure reliability, think track records, closure rates, etc. It's very hard to measure intimacy, and it's even harder to measure self-orientation, much less the use that we put to those measurements, often for incentives. Well, how do you incent somebody to be unselfish? Give them more money? It falls apart. It's a contradiction in terms. So, geez, I'm losing my train of thought here, but that's why is it hard to deal with those? Well, most people in the business world in general, gross generalization, are trained to be rational, cold. Look at the curriculum at a business school. You'll find courses in sales, but they're all sales management, sales force deployment, things that can be analyzed, metricized, and taught. You won't find any MBA program, to my knowledge, that teaches personal sales. Why? Because it's considered unacademic. You you can't quantify it, et cetera. So there's kind of a bias in the world, in the business world in general, against these quote soft, squishy, unmeasurable kinds of things. But of course, they're nonetheless very, very real. And they get to things like the field of sales generally I think rewards or at least puts out images. If you want to be tough, confident, aggressive, challenging, these are all attributes that we don't associate with self-doubt, vulnerability, fear, and therefore it's counterintuitive for a lot of people in the field to think about leading with those factors. But interesting fact, Gallup does an annual survey, basically most and least trusted professions. They've been doing it for 30 years. Always at the bottom of the list, very predictable. Lawyers, used car salesmen, politicians. Everybody gets that. Top of the list, people don't immediately come to mind. The answer is nursing. It's not doctors, it's not teachers, it's nurses. And talk about the job of a nurse boils down to intimacy. We are literally and figuratively naked in front of nurses, and their job is to make it all okay. Total acceptance, total connection with their patient. And that's just a quick gut feel, common sense way of suggesting why it makes a lot of sense that intimacy is the strongest factor. We could go further, but yes.
I think what we'll probably do is save that for another episode,
Sure.
because I think dissecting the trust equation and looking at its application in the real world might be a really useful exercise for people listening.
Right.
I'm also very interested in the work of Mary Gentile in terms of giving voice to values, because I think so often people are operating in environments where they know what's wrong, they can point to it, but they daren't speak the truth.
Right.
And if you're operating in that kind of environment, then nothing really changes. It just compounds what gets worse compounds. And I think when you integrate the lessons from giving voice to values, you can show where safety breaks down and create the structure, the stance, the preparation in order to be able to repair that distrust in the moment. Mary Gentile interviewed about 700 MBA students over 5 years. And she asked them a question along the lines of, have you ever been asked to do something that compromised your values? And 100% of them said yes. 10%, 24% were able to push back
Hmm.
without any negative repercussions. 10% were not only able to push back, but they changed the behavior of those people asking them to behave in an untrustworthy way. So I'm really curious how we can develop a way of, and I know you're skeptical because you just said that you are, of measuring trust. And I'm thinking that maybe what we do is we measure the absence or the diminishment of trust within a relationship, within an interaction, within a sale, within an organization. And I'm curious where that takes your thinking.
I really haven't thought of that. I like the implication of that. The thought it does trigger in my mind, maybe a little tangential, but if you give me a few seconds, it raises it to me. It raises a related question. How do you teach this stuff? How do you get people to behave
Mhm.
in the way of taking those risks? How do you make it easier, safer for them to do so? And I go to leadership and the particular role of role modeling. With all the talk about incentives and structures and so forth, we forget the powerful role that people have in role modeling. Even as individuals, the one person who's brave enough to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes generates a lot of following. Um, I'm reminded if you'll let me share a little vignette here. I was in the audience when Bill Green, the former CEO at Accenture, gave a talk to some global meeting to roll out some new program, and he finished it, and somebody raised their hand and said, "Bill, this is great. Let me ask you a question. Have we yet rolled out the incentives to make sure that when Jose over here calls me from Argentina, I in Austria am incented to, support him? Has that been set up yet?" Seemingly a perfectly reasonable question. And Bill Green's answer was very evident. He got angry. He stood up out of his chair. He walked to the front of the stage. He pointed at the questioner. He said, "I never want to hear that question again from anybody in this room ever. If there's ever a conflict between the incentives and doing the right thing, you do the right thing first and fix the damn incentives later. Am I clear?" Well, 40 people got pretty clear pretty quick. What did he do? He made it okay to stand up. He wasn't even looking for an opportunity, but he saw one and he seized it and he dove towards it. And he said, "Let me make a point about principles that we want to operate by." I think in that moment he gave a lot of people courage to say, "Wow, if he can do it, if he can say that, maybe I can too." So that may be tangential, but that's where your thought led
Actually,
me.
it sparks another thought. I come across organizations that are conflicted. And they're conflicted because they say, on one hand, don't let terms get in the way of winning a deal. And in the same breath, they then say, and go out and grow and maximize to these ludicrous stretch goals. And so they send conflicted messages, and that then creates ambiguity, and it also creates internal conflict.
Yes.
Um, and so often I see sales organizations or go-to-market functions and their leadership, all the way through to finance, the board, and the investors,
Hmm.
operating at odds and creating this needless conflict and enormous waste, because the human cost of every department working towards their own agenda and being successful as far as they can be normally means that the employees, the partners, and the customers are the victims at the end of a long chain of abuse.
Right. Right.
So, what's your message to leadership and to boards and investors when they are sending out those mixed signals and when they are encouraging people through the incentive and compensation plans to behave in a way that is detrimental to trust?
Yeah, it's that's a great question, of course, and a tough one. And let me toss a related question over to you. I've noticed that the things that you and I talk about operating towards a truly customer-centric, buyer-centric approach, they're kind of not hard to grasp conceptually. They are hard to put into place practically. I've noticed groups as big as 100 or 200 are able to do it, but the examples of it scaling up into the thousands are rare and few and far between. I have my own explanations for why that is true, but I'm curious, by the way, what do you think? Why doesn't it seem to scale?
I think the money behind this is quoting a friend of mine, Bernard Hornung, says the money behind an organization permeates the culture beneath it.
Yeah,
And when you're going beyond the 200, you're typically moving into shareholders, private equity, VC.
yeah,
Um, and at that point, it starts to get messy because their motive is not to grow a great business that keeps customers for a very long time. Their motive is to drive the valuation and
yeah,
exit, having extracted as much value as humanly possible. And I think intent is the key driver behind this.
yeah,
And that also comes back to fear,
yeah,
because in speaking to senior execs in large corporations with tens of thousands of people, what I found is that they always have the end of month, end of quarter charade.
yeah,
Um, and the pipeline and forecast theatrics kick in. They're trying to drag deals forward in order to make this quarter's number, which then creates an overdraft in the pipeline that the sales team and marketing team have to make up. And that's a
yeah,
downward spiral that creates more pressure. And there is no virtue to it. And what it requires is leadership to grow a pair, frankly,
yeah.
and to say no. And
Well,
this is where the giving voice to values comes in. But again, that can be a career limiting move in many cases.
well, yes, and a big yes. I agree with all that. I also think there is a correlate, an ideological correlate to the money. And most people in business today have been raised on some version of Milton Friedman or of modern portfolio theory, shareholder value, which, not to mention the managerial ideologies of if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, drive people collectively to believe that the key to all success is short-term financial results, and so there's a whole ideological superstructure built into the entire business environment, which supports exactly what you said and all those behaviors. So it works purely financially and it works intellectually, ideologically.
Well, there's the cult of Jack Welch that
Yeah,
was
yeah,
built on that whole ideology as well.
right,
And the net result of that was that everyone in business schools was taught that essentially human beings are a utility to be exploited, that
right,
you go for the profit and you go for the growth. And then we had 20 years where money was free. And the net result of
right.
that was private equity really got their teeth stuck in, and they skewed I think they've destroyed capitalism, if I'm being perfectly honest.
Yeah. Well, I'd go back even further. People have misinterpreted Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand for centuries. They forget Adam Smith wrote his preferred book, actually, A Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he
Yeah.
argues that, people are human. And we forget that the guy who wrote Wealth of Nations, and we forget and impose our interpretation, the invisible hand somehow is some mechanistic, impersonal. No, he never saw it that way. And you're right. I think his view of capitalism was a much more humanistic view than what we have arrived at today.
Well, the people who quote Smith and use the pin factory never actually got past the first couple of chapters. And so they don't pay attention to where he says that you have to protect against the mercantile class
Mm,
destroying the system.
yeah,
Um, and they've become exactly what Smith said they shouldn't be. So, um, if we look at
This could be a whole other podcast too, by the way.
yeah, absolutely. I'll have to reread both of those books
Yeah, I
again.
should
But
too.
um, if you only read one of those books, which one would you suggest people read?
Uh, the Theory of Moral Sentiments is a slog. Other than that, if you have the patience, I would say that one.
Okay, excellent. So coming back to bringing stuff back on
Yeah,
track, if we look at the practicalities of teaching trust,
yeah,
either as a trainer or a manager or a coach or a
yeah,
leader. How do we go about doing that? Because
yeah.
it's viewed as being soft and fluffy, and I think
Right.
it's anything but.
I agree.
And I know you and I sort of spar a little bit over this in terms of it trust being a hard metric, but distrust certainly is a hard metric that is tangible in the
Yep.
way people show up,
Yeah.
who gets promoted, who gets recruited, who gets fired. So I want to try and reach a point where we can deliver something that leadership and boards and management can get their teeth stuck into. So they've got enough that they can measure, but not in a way that is deterministic, but it's probabilistic. And it allows people to see what is likely to happen if you continue behaving in this untrustworthy way.
Right. Right. Well, that's an interesting angle, and I encourage you to keep pushing on it. I think you're onto something there. In my own work over the years, to how do you teach it? I think it's instructive. We've ended up with several things as the most effective way to teach groups of people about this stuff, and they rhyme with role playing, video clips, logical conundrums to get people to face, this is all not purely logical linear, and stories, all of which are pretty much on the emotional side. The data, people who say, well, show me the data, I find in general, I'll overgeneralize here, tend to be unpersuaded by data. They've already locked it in. But if we confront them with that and say, come on, last time you did this, what did you feel? And they'll say, well, I didn't like the guy, I didn't trust the guy. Well, how much more proof do you need? So my experience has been the most effective way to teach it probably does lie more on the emotional, the storytelling, the role playing, that kind of stuff. But again, I encourage you to pursue that direction. I haven't really thought of that angle on it. It's intriguing.
Well, the experiential side of learning, I think, and
Yeah.
getting your hands dirty and
Yes.
failing in safe, tiny environments where you
Yeah.
can always reverse out of it is great. Story is massively powerful,
Right.
and your point, I think, was made brilliantly by the comedian Ronnie Cheng, where he was talking about all these keyboard warriors who were D students saying, "Show me the evidence, show me the data about COVID." And
Yeah.
even if you presented them with PhD level evidence, they would still find a way because
Yeah.
of their schema and their belief system to argue against it. And I think part of the challenge that we've got is so much of management doctrine and the MBA programs, as you mentioned, is trying to boil it down to something that's measurable
Yeah.
and tangible. And that's not how human beings really behave. You only have to look at the buyer's journey and the deep mismatch with CRM systems that are
Yes.
effectively trying to push people through linear gates
Right.
when the buyer goes quiet on you because Gartner calls it deconflicting. They're going into the second and third rooms and they're having the fights internally because you haven't made it easy for them
Yeah.
to take your story and your message and deliver it to somebody else in an unedited way that they say, oh, bloody hell, that's so obvious. Let's do
Right.
that.
Right.
And so you've got all of these different stakeholders who are conflicted and also vying for the same limited resource, but they're measured on different things. And
Yeah.
I think part of the challenge here is how do we create metrics that everybody is in service to? So Alan Sang talks about mission and purpose. Mission is what we are trying to achieve, and purpose is how we go about doing it, how we do business around here. So Bill Green talking about you never let the comp plan get in the way of doing the right thing. That's a purpose that needs to be
Hmm.
lived and etched on everybody's psyche.
Right.
But too often, because they're focused on the short term, they never get
Yeah.
anywhere close to that.
Yes. Yeah. The whole short-term phenomenon is, worthy of its own thing. I'll give you a parallel example of what you're saying. Fred Reichheld, years ago, wrote a book called The Loyalty Effect, which, in my opinion, is arguably one of the greatest strategy books ever written and underappreciated. And it was loaded with data. And he basically said, repeat business with people existing clients, is massively more profitable than, constantly seeking out new clients, filling the top of the funnel, all that sort of thing. He later became justly famous for the Net Promoter Score, NPS. It seems to me he's much more famous now for the NPS than he is for the whole loyalty effect. And my lesson from that, NPS basically boiled it down, made it too simple. What's the Einstein thing? Everything should be as simple as it can be, no simpler. NPS, it's one number, that purports to measure everything. It's pretty cool, pretty neat. But I've just last month I was at a conference of CROs and CMOs from major professional service organizations, and they're spending millions of dollars refining their NPS metrics. And I think, no, get back to basics. Go right what Reichheld wrote originally. What are the dynamics? And you can use data here, but you don't oversimplify it to the point that people mindlessly follow a single metric. We need a little more richness in it, which I'm hopeful that what you're talking about does allow for richness. It's the model. It's not the data. It's the model that gets people thinking. What are the components? How do they interact?
Well, Gartner's data on this is really interesting, which is that it costs between 5 and 25x more to win a new logo than it does to sell to an existing one.
Yeah.
And I always teach my clients that the syntax is protect first, keep what you've got, then expand. And
Yep.
far down the road, focus on winning.
Right.
I had a customer interview with a client of mine, and he came to me originally because he wanted to fill the top of his pipeline up. And I said, don't even think about it. You've been in
Right.
the industry for 30 years. You know everybody you need to know. And within 3 weeks, he picked up some big accounts, and he's now doing 3 times as much revenue
Yeah.
as he was before. But
Right.
now he's doing the kind of work he actually wants to do,
Yeah.
and his customers are loyal.
Exactly.
And unless we break that pattern. But again, this is tied back to shareholder value because the
Yes.
way private equity values a business is in new logos, in terms of revenue growth, EBIT, and
Right.
so on. But what I'm seeing in small pockets is more focus on net recurring revenue and
Hmm.
gross recurring revenue, which
Right.
require you to focus on the renewals and repeats.
Exactly.
And if you're not looking at your churn rate as your first port of call,
Right.
then I think you're in big trouble. And I think to put a bullet in the NPS score, I think what we really need to do is focus on time to value because buyers do not buy your product or service. They rent an outcome.
Yeah.
And measuring how fast they get to the outcome that they intended when they made the purchase is a far more reliable indicator of whether or not you're actually building the conditions for trust to exist. And it's also a lot more sustainable because, as you said, under promise and over deliver. Well, if the expectation does not exactly match, sorry, the outcome on first use does not exactly match the expectation, buyer's remorse sets in, even
Yeah.
if the outcome is better than they expected,
Right.
especially if you do that repeatedly, because you keep compounding that actually what you say doesn't have
Doesn't.
veracity.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well said.
Okay, so if we think about how individuals can operate despite the environment, the culture, their management, their comp plan
Right.
in a way that is worthy of trust,
Right.
and to do so in a way that other people look over the fence and say, What's Charlie doing that's so different?"
Right.
How do we encourage people to do that? And the adjunct to it is, how do we encourage them to do so without getting fired by jealous people?
Right. Well, that's a great question and one that comes up a lot in my own work. Again, I work mainly with professional service firms, so I spend a lot of time talking to, let's say, accountants, for example, and they raise that objection, if you will, all the time. You don't know my boss. I've got to meet these metrics, I got to meet the numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And I point out to them, actually, when it comes to trust, you have way more agency than you think you have. Um, if you're able to figure out how to fully come from a place of being willing to trust and being trustworthy, it doesn't take long for your clients and customers, your coworkers, everybody to notice it. It's quite noticeable within a quarter, 2 quarters, maximum 3 quarters. So we're talking 9 months. Now, if you have a sales manager that says you have to meet this quarterly target, and you can't convince them to wait one more quarter for something that makes a lot of sense, you either have a stupid sales manager or you're a bad salesperson yourself. It's not that hard a case to make. And in many cases, you don't even have to ask permission. You just start behaving in a different way, different conversations with your clients, and the numbers start to materialize pretty quickly. So in many cases, it's like the old pogo. We have met the enemy, and it is us. We are the enemy. Our own bad thinking leads us to do the wrong things. We There's very little to prevent any individual salesperson from behaving in a more trust-based way, and the results come a lot quicker than we tend to think.
What can people do in order to develop their trust building muscle then?
Yeah. Well, I usually tell people some of the simplest ways to build trust are the easiest one of all probably goes to reliability. Make a lot of promises and keep every one of them. They don't even have to be big promises. I'll show up at a quarter to two. Show up at a quarter to two. How hard is that? Do that 10 times in a row. Guess what? They begin to trust you quite a bit more. But maybe the biggest one is simply get better at listening. And I don't mean listening to collect data. I don't even mean so-called active listening. I mean listening so that the other party feels heard, so that you can see an emotional reaction. Ah, he's paying attention to me. He gets what I'm saying. That, it's listening. It's not any more complicated, which is not to say it's simple, but listening is a huge one. I'd almost stop at those two. Those are top of the list. And we could add a dozen others, but those are big ones.
Mark Goulston, who was one of my mentors, said that you should be interested, not interesting.
Yes,
And I think far too often in a sales situation or a management situation, we spend time trying to make our point
right.
instead of genuinely understand the other person.
And the truth is, people don't give a damn about your damn point. They really don't. Another way to put what you just said, my one-liner for it is to cultivate an attitude of curiosity. If you are constantly curious, you are by definition other-oriented, not self-oriented, and people pick up on that pretty quickly. If you're genuinely curious about what does this issue mean to you, where does it come from, what happens to you if this, that, and the other, and behaviorally, you lean in, you stare at them, you look them in the eye, you follow their conversation where they take it, not where you were going to drive it. Those are ways of showing interest, other orientation, curiosity. It works.
Ah, okay. I mean, I've got so many questions going through my mind. I'm just trying to select the right one now. Okay. Um, from a customer's perspective or from the other person's point of view, because I'm a huge proponent of always think as your customer or think
Right.
as your report, rather than thinking about what you can do to them, take from them, convince them to do. How can we develop real empathy for the other person?
I don't have a one-liner answer for that. It really is a great question. I would just add this. You're asking that question in the context of buyers and sellers and customers and providers and so forth. It's also an aspect of human personal growth. As you become a better person, you become better at relating to other human beings, and it's no different in the business world, the world of B2B sales, for example. We tend to think, there's business and there, the old line from the Godfather, it's not personal, it's business. It is personal. It is business. They're the same. So that ability to develop empathy, I think we should draw from, the broader field of human endeavors, whether it's psychology or pop psychology. I'm rambling here because I don't have a clean, quick answer. I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I'm a big fan of Albert Ellis's ABCDE model.
Yeah.
And Ellis has this wonderful framework where he has you essentially look in the mirror. And it's often a very uncomfortable moment where you look at what the activating event is, that's the A, and what is the belief that that activating event then triggers.
Hmm.
And what are the consequences behaviorally in terms of what that belief drives? And then dispute your belief.
Right.
So, one of my favorite maxims is go looking for evidence that you are wrong.
Yes.
Go looking for people who can prove you wrong. Run to the sound of gunfire.
Right.
Most people will run away from difficult situations because they conflate all conflict as being the same.
Right.
Constructive conflict is the single most powerful resource that we have if we have the courage to go looking for the evidence that we're wrong. And so that disputation is really key because it helps us synthesize an effective new belief. And I think the mirror, journaling,
Yeah.
having a buddy, a coach, mentors, special interest groups. So you and I obviously have the Sellers Anonymous community that we're trying to build. So Sellers Anonymous, for those who are unfamiliar with it, is essentially AA for recovering salespeople
Yeah.
who realize that you don't break the Jimmy Carr rule, which is if you meet three assholes by 12 o'clock, it's probably you. Um, and your job is not to convince people. Your
Right.
job is to facilitate them making the best decision possible for themselves
Right.
that they can live with now and for a long time in the future. So it means that we get away from manipulation, coercion, fear-based selling.
Right.
And so I think we've got to start really taking a good, hard, long look in the mirror and ask ourselves, are we the sorts of people who like to be convinced, closed, handled, manipulated, lied
Right.
to, or put under pressure? Well, why in God's name do you think anyone else would either?
Right, exactly. And for those following along with all the literary references we've been dropping here, let me mention Peter Boghossian, who is
Yeah.
and he himself quotes Socrates, the wise man is he who knows nothing and knows that he knows nothing. And Boghossian, in a very conversational, current mode of talking, says exactly the same thing. He's got 1,000 ways to doubt yourself. If you don't believe you can be wrong, why should anybody else believe you could be wrong? Or why should they trust you in arguing? So, yes, to everything you said.
Boghossian's very interesting
Yeah,
because he built street epistemology.
exactly.
Again, this isn't meant to be volatile for anybody, but his view is that religion is a mental condition. And
Yeah,
so what he does is go out into the street with a stopwatch and a clipboard and walks up to strangers and says, "Do you mind if I have a conversation with you? Take three
right,
minutes." And then he
right.
starts a stopwatch. And the idea is to create a moment of doubt.
Exactly.
Well, I think, and
And,
then
and
walk
by the way,
away.
although he led with the religion question, it's much more broadly applicable.
Well,
And
I built that model into all of my stuff because I believe that when we can create that seed of doubt, there is a
right,
potential for actually making transformative change. Instead
exactly.
of change, which is sort of tactical and short term, this is lifelong. And
Right.
if I can create a seed of doubt in the minds of anyone listening as to whether or not trust matters or whether they should be closing somebody instead of opening. Suzanne posted today a great post on LinkedIn where she said, always be closing means that you're basically ending something, whereas you should
Yes.
always be opening.
I
And
love it.
my view is that when we make a sale, what we should be doing is trying to construct and design the whole buying experience and journey towards the third renewal, the third expansion sale, the third
Exactly.
co-creation of a new solution, the
Sure.
third paying referral. And anything less than that means that you have to go back to the drawing board and start afresh every month, which frankly
Absolutely.
is economically suicidal.
Yeah. Another metaphor, if all you do is pluck fruit off the tree, eventually the tree will die. If you nurture the tree, you'll have fruit for life. We're back to short term, long term. Yes.
If we've realized that trust is really built in moments and it can be damaged in moments, but if
Yep.
you've got that emotional bank account in place, then people will see it as an anomaly. Um, what can we do to design our approach, whether it's in management, leadership, communication, sales, aftercare, customer success, in order to ensure that we're creating powerful trust building moments?
Right. My answer to that, maybe, I don't know how well this works for other people. I've found in my own life and my own work, for me, one of the more valuable things is pick out a few mantras, a few I love one-liners. Resentment is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. Stuff like that, or the difference between me and God is that God knows he's not me. Um, and I ruminate on those things. I love those little things. And I have, five or six that I think of probably half a dozen times a day, and I apply them. I mean, the whole notion of resentment, for example, it's basically wishing that the world were other than what the world is. It's total waste of time. Here's another one for you. If you have one foot in yesterday and one foot in tomorrow, you're well positioned to piss on today. Uh,
I shall definitely be stealing that one.
you're welcome to it. Not original with me. All these things that take us away from the person in front of us in the moment, reacting to what's real, and instead replacing it with some ego-driven, fear-based notion of what is or ought to be or should be, is just a destructive and a waste of time. So I find reflecting, ruminating on little insights like that, it's become automatic to me. I'm, enough decades on the planet that I've learned a habit of remembering I'm not in charge of anything. And the best thing I can do is A, control my own reactions, and B, I can influence people. I can have an effect on how they think. That's about it. And if I stay within that lane and am responsible for my own actions and not responsible for other people's actions, and stop worrying about what other people think of me and how they, trying to control how they perceive me, life gets a lot easier, a lot better, and a lot more effective.
Given that we are creatures of emotion, and my understanding is that we first of all have a thought that then creates a feeling and it fires off a whole load of hormones, whether they be oxytocin or adrenaline or dopamine or whatever. And those feelings create emotions, and those emotions drive behavior.
Right.
What does it feel like when you are trusted?
Hmm. I yeah, I mean, I want to hear your answer too, but I would say it feels A, great, B, it imbues one with a sense of humility and responsibility. If somebody trusts me, I think, oh my gosh, I better live up to that. It's humbling. Am I going to stay true to what I just did right? Am I going to do the right thing again? So yeah, it's nice, it's flattering, but it's also humbling, and it's especially it encourages us to do more of that same right thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, for me, I find my guard drops.
Yeah.
Um, I don't feel the tension in my chest, my neck, my back. And I stop scanning for danger.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
and I'm not spending my time rehearsing my next line or thinking about my next question.
Right.
And I stop judging myself.
Great.
I think those are primarily the feelings that I get.
Right.
Um, and I'm okay saying I don't know when I feel trusted.
Yep.
I'm feel like I won't be punished for my honesty. And I'm not calculating or defending.
Right.
So that probably makes me feel a bit braver.
Yeah, I think so too. And by the way, the question you posed was, how do I feel when somebody trusts me, when I am trusted? Begs the question, well, how do I get to that feeling? And one of the best answers is trust them. Go back to that reciprocity principle. Be open with them. Be transparent with them. Model the behavior that you want. You take the first risk. Many people have said variations on the version, the best way to make a man trustworthy is to trust him. So part of the lesson in sales is lead with that. Lead with humility. I mean, one of my greatest opening lines for sales is, I could be wrong, but I've looked at the data here, this, that, and the other, and it seems to me that maybe this is an issue. Is it? And as long as that question is intelligent and possibly true, there's only two answers that come from that, and they're both good. The first one is, yeah, that's a great insight. Let's talk more about that. We all think that's the best answer possible. The real best answer possible is when somebody says, yeah, good thinking, but no, you're dead wrong. It's actually this, not that. In which case you say, oh my God, I never thought of that until now. Of course you're right. What? Tell me more about that. And they will love to tell you more about that because everybody is starved for attention. So feed their attention desire.
Fair. Okay. So you've been studying trust for 40 years or so. Where do you still get it wrong? What's the bit you're still working on?
Well, it's asymptotic, right? We never achieve perfection. You just look for progress. And I think I still find myself, getting annoyed. I still find myself telling small lies. And then I usually catch myself and I say, "Ah, you're at it again, you idiot. The itty bitty shitty committee is in operation in my brain. And get rid of it. Exercise those stupid demons." It's a constant battle to, stay on the improvement side of things. Um, yeah,
Let's bring it back into a sales
yeah.
context. What do buyers really fear?
Mm. I never asked that specific question. That's a great question. I think they fear being taken advantage of, comes to mind, being unfairly treated, like somebody else is getting a better deal than I am, which is one of the reasons I and you, I think, always suggest get price out in the open early. Because very much when you're meeting customers, one of the big questions on their mind is, how much is this going to cost? And conventional sales training says, don't mention price until you've established value, which I think is dead wrong. Get price out there. And at least in some form, this is going to be
How
bigger.
do you do that?
Yeah, you early on in the conversation say, listen, before either one of us embarrasses ourselves, I think this feels like a high 6-digit or a low 7-digit number. Are we in the right ballpark? We can refine it later. But are we are we the right people to be talking at this point? And you're usually, yeah, okay, that sounds about right. Good. You've mentioned price. You haven't nailed yourself down to anything, but you've alleviated the emotional distress that the buyer is feeling by, not talking about this question that's foremost in their mind.
And when they try and squeeze you for a discount?
My answer to that, as you know, is no. The way that I've generally teach people is have a few published, known standard discounts that you do offer, and don't do anything else. And when people say, if they ask you, say, well, we'd like our customary 20% discount, you say, I recognize it may be customary to you, but we don't do that. And what I can offer you in return is to say nobody else gets a better deal. Nobody will ever get a better deal than what I'm offering you. Whether they're Google or JP Morgan Chase, they pay not a nickel less than you. So no, I'm not going to give you a discount, but I can give you the assurance that nobody else is getting a better deal. And by the way, the reason you can be sure that I stick to that is I just said that out loud. I've said it in writing. And if I went back on my word, I'd be blowing up my company. And frankly, you're not worth giving a discount to blow up my company. I'm never going to change that answer. So, and actually people laugh and say, okay, I get it. That's cool. It
And what
works.
about the some examples of the types of discounts you do give?
Volume discounts, at least in my business, selling workshops, keynote speeches, webinars, that kind of thing. If people buy 10 of those and there's a substantially the same topic or same client, there's a repetitive nature to that it saves me money. I don't have to, it's not the same as preparing for 10 different clients. So I'm happy to grant a volume discount under those conditions and to say so up front and tell them how much it is. That's a good example. We tend also to give the lower rates for nonprofits and governmental institutions. Other than that, nothing. New client, nope, sorry. Famous client, forget it. No.
Music to my ears. Discounting's a sin.
Discounting is a sin. I like that.
So, wrapping up then, if we were to walk into a trust-based company,
Yeah.
what would it look like for real?
Huh. Well, I've worked with, as I said, smaller groups. I can think of one small company, Bangor Savings Bank, which I would say the whole company's that way. They're not that big. It looks like people are happy. People are friendly, conversational with each other. They all come up with kind of the same instinctive answer to a given situation. They're highly collaborative. They don't make that much of a difference between talking with each other and talking with their customers. There's a transparency to them. Things like that.
So, if we look at your life's work, what do you want it to mean when you look back on it?
I would like people to think in terms of my work that, gee, he didn't really come up with anything new, but he made a few things hang together in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated. That makes sense. That would be my ultimate compliment. Oh, he makes sense. Good. I'd be thrilled with that. That's about it.
So, if someone is looking at a tough quarter
Hmm.
and they are feeling the pressure to maybe bend the truth, manipulate, pressure, what would you say to them in that moment?
Don't give in. I mean, play the long game. It's only one quarter. If you look back 10 years from now, you'll forget that quarter. If you let your life be run by even you let the camel's nose under the tent, it's infectious, and you'll just you'll be a recidivist. You'll do it again. It's something to be very much watched out for and not indulged.
I think it was something that you wrote or said, which is that when we start to make these compromises, they're incremental, and
Mm.
it's the hole in the dike that starts to open up, and then it becomes more and more permissible. And as we do it more often, we end up getting caught in the slipstream of it all. Um,
Yeah.
so if you're a manager and you see these behaviors creeping into your team, what's your advice there?
Uh, the opposite is true too. Doing things right is also infectious. If you start behaving as an individual in trusting and trustworthy ways, other people around you will pick up on it. So the positive virtues work as well in that kind of infectious manner. We all have more agency than we think we do. So I double down on trust positive behaviors, attitudes, mindsets, and preach that gospel. That's maybe the best counteraction to the negative.
Well, I think we've got to catch people doing the right thing.
Hmm.
And rather than demonizing people who are getting it wrong, because
Yeah,
that generally develops resistance,
yeah,
um, catch the people doing it right and put those behaviors on a pedestal. And I think far too often we do the opposite of that. And we try and find out why someone is wrong, why someone needs to change,
yeah.
because of our desire to make things better. But by doing that, we make things worse.
Yes, that's well put. That's a great insight. Absolutely.
Charlie, this has been incredibly rich as a conversation.
It
What I'm
has.
taking from today is pretty simple. Trust is not abstract. It lives in tiny moments, in how safe we other people feel because of the conditions that we create,
Hmm.
and in how we show up when it costs us something. If we can help leaders and sellers to spot the moments that break trust and design for the moments that build it, then everything else becomes easier.
Yeah, yeah, that's well said. To anybody listening to this, my own personal suggestion, I hope it works for others, pick out two or maybe three things that you heard in this conversation, whether from Marcus or me or both of us, and ruminate on that. Write them down, put them up in front of a yellow sticky on your computer screen, whatever you do, and think about it and let it infect your overall thinking.
Agreed. And also, please join us. We have three Sellers Anonymous going at the moment, one in the US, one in Australia, and one in the UK. So you can check us out. Myself and Charlie are on the European one. I think Charlie also attends Morgan McDonald's sessions over in the States, and Pat Bakusis is running them in Australia for Asia Pac. So if this has tweaked your interest, then please do join us because it is a sponsorship organization. It's going to grow only by referral and by introduction. And what we're doing there is we're sponsoring people in to help them grow and develop their trust muscle, if you like.
Yeah.
And we're looking for other people. So it's a movement. It's not a coaching session. It's an opportunity for you to meet with like-minded people, hear their story of how they've evolved and what the positive impact has been, and also some of the trials and tribulations of getting there,
Yeah.
because we've all gone through quite a bit of scar tissue to reach this point. Um, Charlie, thank you so much for a fantastic episode.
Oh, thank you,
Do,
Marcus. Honestly, this has been just as good for me as for you. Thank you very much.
do you have a final thought to leave people with?
Ah, no, I think we've said it multiple times. I got nothing new to add.
Excellent. So, Charlie Green, thank you.
Thank you, Marcus.
So this is Marcus Kauke signing off once again from the Inquisitor podcast. If you found this useful, then please like, comment, share, take notes, and try and implement one or two of the ideas that we've talked about and do them in small increments. Don't try and boil the ocean. Just work on something small and safe that's reversible. So if it backfires, there's no harm done. It's not going to be a career-ending move. But apply compound interest to this. If
Mhm.
you improve and become a little bit more trustworthy every day, incrementally that compounds. And if you start out with $100 and you improve, or you start out with a baseline of 100, you will improve by 30% if you only improve by 0.1% a day. Now, that's an incredible multiplier because when you go to 0.5%, you're going to over 300%. And when you really stretch yourself and 1% more trustworthy, that's a
Yeah.
1,400% improvement over the
And that's
course of a year.
just to take that. This is not one of these things where you don't get the benefits until you hit 90%. You get the benefits from 0.1% on. They do indeed accumulate and exponentially multiply.
Absolutely. So, in the meantime, stay safe, happy selling, and get in touch. Bye bye.